She did not notice the footsteps behind her at first because the garage had trained everyone who used it to ignore echoes. On weekday evenings in Austin, the West Campus sublevel parking structure settled into a predictable rhythm. Engines cooling, doors slamming, fluorescent lights humming with a faint electrical fatigue. Students passed through with earbuds in, backpacks slung low, minds already somewhere else. Among them was Emily Harper, 21 years old, a junior at the University of Texas, studying communications, working part-time at a cafe on Guadalupe Street. She parked on level B2 most nights because it was usually empty and closer to the stairwell that led up toward her apartment complex. Emily's life, by most accounts, was orderly. She woke early, ran along Shoal Creek when the weather allowed, attended lectures, worked afternoon shifts, and studied late. Friends described her as cautious without being fearful, attentive to small details, the kind of person who texted when she got home. She shared a 2-bedroom apartment with another student and rarely stayed out late. On the night it happened, an unremarkable Tuesday in October 2018, she left the campus library just after 9:40 p.m., carrying a canvas tote filled with notes and a paperback novel she did not intend to read. The garage smelled faintly of oil and damp concrete. A storm earlier in the evening had left the air heavy, pressing down, amplifying every sound. Emily descended the stairs, her shoes clicking in a steady cadence, the lights flickering briefly as she passed beneath them. Her car sat alone near the back wall, a silver sedan dusted with a fine film of grit. She unlocked it with a key fob, the sharp chirp briefly piercing the low hum of ventilation fans. That was when the footsteps adjusted their pace. Security footage later would show a man entering the frame seconds after Emily, his face partially obscured by the shadow of a support column. He wore jeans, a dark hoodie, a baseball cap pulled low. There was nothing in his appearance that drew attention. He walked the way students walked, unhurried, unremarkable, as if he belonged there. Emily sensed movement to her left and turned slightly, just enough to register a shape where there had been none. She felt the first flicker of unease then, subtle and easily dismissed. Parking garages played tricks on perception. Echoes bounced, lights stuttered, shadows lengthened without warning. She told herself it was nothing and reached for the driver's side door. The man closed the distance in 3 steps. What followed unfolded quickly, but not chaotically. There was no shouting captured on camera, no frantic chase. Witnesses later reported hearing a muffled sound, something like a dropped bag, a sharp intake of breath, but nothing that registered as a scream. The man grabbed Emily from behind, one arm locking around her shoulders, the other pressing something hard and cold against her side. Her keys fell to the concrete, skittering beneath the car. Police reports would later describe the weapon as a knife, small and utilitarian, the kind sold at hardware stores. Emily struggled, twisting, trying to pull free, her shoes scraping against the painted floor. The man dragged her toward the darker corner near the stairwell, where a burned-out light left a pocket of shadow. The ventilation system continued its steady exhale. Indifferent. The attack lasted less than 4 minutes. When it was over, the man left the way he had come, moving quickly but not running, his figure dissolving into the vertical lines of the garage ramps. Emily was found just after 10 p.m. by another student returning to her car, who later told investigators she first noticed the silence, the absence of ordinary garage noise, before she saw the body. Emily died from a single stab wound to the chest. The Austin Police Department treated the case with urgency. The location, a campus-adjacent parking structure, triggered immediate concern. Officers sealed off the garage, collecting shell casings that were not there, footprints that blurred into one another, fibers that yielded little. The knife was gone. There were no witnesses who saw the attacker's face clearly, no license plates, no immediate suspects. Emily's family arrived from Round Rock before dawn. Her mother sat with detectives in a windowless interview room, answering questions she did not understand the purpose of. Emily's routines, her relationships, whether she had mentioned being afraid of anyone. The questions implied a logic that felt foreign, as if the crime required a narrative explanation that could be constructed from small personal details. Her father stared at the table, his hands folded, listening to the hum of the lights. News of the murder spread quickly through campus. Candlelight vigils appeared overnight, clusters of students standing quietly with wax dripping onto their hands. Classes continued, but attendance thinned. People walked faster through garages, held their phones tighter, glanced over their shoulders with a new attentiveness. The environment itself seemed altered. Spaces once neutral now felt observant, complicit. Detectives reviewed hours of surveillance footage, tracing the man's path backward through the garage and outward into the surrounding streets. He appeared briefly on a camera near the exit, then vanished. Analysts noted the deliberate nature of his movements, the lack of hesitation. This was not a crime of opportunity in the traditional sense. It suggested preparation, familiarity with the space, a comfort with remaining unseen. As days turned into weeks, tips poured in. A man in a hoodie seen near campus. A stranger lingering too long by an elevator. None led anywhere. The case file grew thick with statements that contradicted one another, with timelines that overlapped imperfectly. Emily's phone revealed nothing unusual, no threatening messages, no secret meetings. Her life, examined under the harsh light of investigation, remained stubbornly ordinary. Psychologists consulted by the department spoke about predatory behavior, about offenders who blend into routine environments, who exploit predictability. The garage itself became a focal point, a space designed for transit, not safety, its blind corners and mechanical noise offering cover. The city installed brighter lights, added cameras, posted patrols. These changes arrived too late to matter for Emily. Her friends struggled with the absence. They described moments when they reached for their phones to text her, forgetting, for a fraction of a second, that she would not answer. Her roommate moved out before the semester ended, unable to sleep in the quiet apartment. The cafe where Emily worked left her name on the schedule for weeks, an oversight no one corrected. The investigation stalled without resolution. Months later, detectives would quietly acknowledge what the evidence suggested. The man who killed Emily had likely done this before, or would do it again, moving through familiar spaces, relying on the same fragile assumptions of safety that governed daily life. The case remained open, its unanswered questions settling into the city's collective memory like fine dust. In the end, what lingered was not just the violence, but the realization of how easily it had slipped into the ordinary flow of an evening, unnoticed until it was irreversible. The absence of answers began to weigh on the city in a way that was harder to name, but impossible to ignore. Detectives assigned full time to Emily Harper's case settled into a slow, methodical routine. They rewatched the footage so many times, they could recite the timing of the flickering lights and the hum pattern of the ventilation fans. Frame by frame, they studied the man's posture, the way his left shoulder dipped slightly as he walked, the controlled economy of his movements. Behavioral analysts noted the lack of visible panic, the precision with which he closed distance, the confidence of someone who understood the environment intimately. He did not rush because he did not need to. They canvassed nearby apartment complexes, spoke to residents who had lived there for years and those who had just moved in. Some remembered seeing a man who fit the description. A dark hoodie, a baseball cap, yet the description itself was almost meaningless in a student-heavy neighborhood. It described hundreds of people on any given night. Tips blurred together, becoming variations on the same uncertain memory. A composite sketch was attempted, built from fragments, a jawline glimpsed under fluorescent light, eyes half hidden by shadow. The sketch circulated briefly online, then faded as interest waned. There were no arrests, no public suspects. The case moved from the front page to the inside columns, then disappeared from daily coverage altogether. Emily's parents returned to their routines, though nothing about them felt routine anymore. Her mother kept Emily's room unchanged, the bed still made with the quilt she had brought from college. Her father avoided the garage at work, parking instead on the street, even when it meant walking farther. They attended meetings with detectives every few months, each one ending with the same careful language. No new developments. The investigation remains active. We haven't forgotten. For those who had known Emily, memory itself became unreliable. Friends replayed their last conversations, searching for overlooked clues. Had she mentioned someone watching her? Had she seemed distracted? Each recollection shifted slightly over time, shaped by guilt and the need for explanation. The mind tried to impose causality where none was evident, to transform randomness into warning signs that could have been heeded. The parking garage continued to operate. Students still parked on level B2. The brighter lights cast harsher shadows, the added cameras blinking steadily, recording without judgment. People told themselves that the danger had passed, that the changes made it safer now. Yet unease lingered, a low-grade tension that surfaced whenever footsteps echoed too closely behind. In interviews conducted months later, psychologists spoke about the enduring impact of unresolved violence. Without an identified perpetrator, fear had no fixed object. It diffused instead, attaching itself to environments rather than individuals. The garage became symbolic, a place where anonymity and familiarity intersected, where ordinary routines could be interrupted without warning. Detectives quietly explored the possibility that the crime was linked to others. They reviewed reports from neighboring cities, looking for similar patterns: lone victims, transitional spaces, minimal interaction. Nothing matched closely enough to establish a connection. The absence of a pattern was itself unsettling. It suggested a crime that existed outside the frameworks designed to contain it. Emily's case was discussed in criminal justice seminars, cited as an example of situational vulnerability. Students learned about lighting, sight lines, the psychology of ambush. These lessons were abstracted, stripped of personal detail, turned into diagrams and bullet points. Emily's name appeared briefly, then was replaced by terms like the victim and the subject, language that created distance even as it claimed objectivity. Years passed. New students arrived on campus, unaware of what had happened in that garage. The city changed in subtle ways: new buildings, new businesses, new rhythms. The memory of the crime receded, resurfacing only on anniversaries or when a similar incident elsewhere made the news. Emily's parents marked each year privately, lighting a candle, speaking her name aloud. The man who killed her was never identified. He remained a silhouette in grainy footage, a set of behaviors analyzed and reanalyzed without resolution. In the absence of accountability, the concept of justice became abstract, something discussed rather than experienced. There was no trial, no verdict, no formal acknowledgement of responsibility. What remained was a quiet reckoning with perception. The realization that safety is often inferred rather than guaranteed, that familiarity can mask risk. People continued to walk through garages, to trust routines, because living otherwise was unsustainable. Yet beneath that trust lay an awareness, subtle, persistent, that ordinary spaces could harbor extraordinary harm. Emily Harper became a name spoken softly, a story told without embellishment. Her life, defined in public memory by the manner of her death, was remembered by those who loved her for its small, unremarkable details. The way she laughed when surprised, the notes she left on the fridge, the careful way she planned her days. These memories resisted the violence, asserting a humanity that could not be reduced to a case file. In the end, the unresolved nature of the crime offered no comfort, no moral clarity. It left behind questions that did not resolve neatly, only a deeper understanding of how fragile perception can be, and how easily evil can move through the same spaces as everyone else, unnoticed, until it is too late. Over time, the silence around the case grew heavier than the initial shock, settling into daily life with a persistence that resisted resolution. For the detectives still assigned to Emily Harper's file, the work shifted from active pursuit to sustained vigilance. The case never closed, never moved to cold storage, but it occupied a quieter corner of their workload. Every few months, a new tip arrived, often vague, occasionally compelling enough to revisit old notes. They cross-referenced names, reran database searches, rechecked alibis that had already been deemed inconclusive. Each time, the trail dissolved just as it seemed to solidify, leaving behind the same incomplete outline of a man whose defining feature was his absence. The uncertainty had its own psychological weight. Investigators spoke privately about the toll of cases like this, crimes without resolution, where effort did not translate into outcome. Without an arrest, there was no narrative arc to complete, no point at which responsibility could be assigned and processed. The work became a form of maintenance rather than progress, preserving the possibility of justice without ever reaching it. Emily's parents learned to live with that suspended state. Their lives divided into before and after, but the after never stabilized. Grief did not soften into something manageable. It simply changed shape. Her mother found herself scanning crowds unconsciously, studying men's faces for familiarity she could not articulate. Her father read court opinions late at night, searching for reassurance in the idea that systems worked, that order prevailed more often than it failed. Neither found what they were looking for. They were invited to speak at campus safety forums, asked to lend their voices to prevention efforts. They agreed when they could, though the experience was disorienting, standing in front of strangers, recounting details that no longer felt entirely real. Each retelling fixed the story in a particular form, narrowing it, reducing a life to a sequence of events that fit into an hour-long program. Afterward, they returned home exhausted, aware that awareness itself had limits. The garage where Emily died remained structurally unchanged despite cosmetic improvements. The concrete still held moisture after rain. The air still carried the same metallic scent. At night, the lights cast a colder glow, illuminating corners that had once been hidden. Students reported feeling safer, though no one could articulate precisely why. Safety, in this context, was an impression, a sense produced by visibility rather than certainty. Sociologists studying the aftermath noted how quickly environments absorb violence without visibly acknowledging it. Spaces resuming their function. People adapt. The memory of danger becomes diffuse, less about a specific threat and more about a general unease that ebbs and flows. The garage continued to fill and empty, its purpose unchanged, even as it carried an invisible history. Emily's friends moved forward unevenly. Some left Austin entirely, transferring schools, seeking distance from reminders they could not escape. Others stayed, determined not to let the crime dictate their lives. They marked milestones, graduations, first jobs, marriages, aware of the absence woven through each celebration. Emily's name surfaced in conversations unexpectedly, a brief pause following, as if everyone involved needed to acknowledge her before moving on. In academic circles, the case became a reference point in discussions about urban safety and gendered violence. Researchers analyzed the convergence of routine activities and offender behavior, the role of environmental design. The language was precise, neutral, built to inform rather than console. Emily Harper existed in these discussions as data, anonymized even as her name was cited, her individuality flattened to fit broader conclusions. Years after the murder, a similar attack in another city briefly reignited attention. Reporters contacted Austin police, asking whether the cases might be connected. Detectives reviewed the new information carefully, hoping for alignment that never came. The similarities were superficial, the differences decisive. Once again, the possibility of closure receded. The man who committed the crime remained undefined, his motivations inferred only through behavior. Analysts speculated about control, about opportunism shaped by familiarity. He had chosen a place where movement was expected, where sound blended into ambient noise. He had relied on the same assumptions that allowed the garage to function, that people passed through without scrutiny, trusting the environment to be neutral. That reliance, investigators agreed, was the most unsettling aspect. There was no elaborate deception, no forced entry into a protected space. The violence emerged from within the ordinary, exploiting its rhythms rather than disrupting them. It suggested that evil did not always announce itself, did not always require extraordinary conditions to act. As time distanced the event, public memory softened. New students parked on level B2 without knowing why the lighting seemed excessive or why older residents avoided certain stairwells. The city's population grew, its attention shifting to new concerns. Emily's case remained unsolved, but it no longer defined the present moment. For her family, however, time did not dilute significance. Anniversaries remained sharp. Her mother continued to imagine alternate futures. Emily at 25, at 30, visions that coexisted uneasily with reality. Her father maintained a quiet anger, less directed at any individual than at the randomness that allowed such harm without consequence. In reflecting on the case, those closest to it returned again and again to perception, to the idea that safety is constructed from patterns that usually hold until they do not. That trust is extended automatically, embedded in routine, rarely examined until it is broken. Emily had done everything expected of her, followed familiar paths, moved through a shared space, assumed continuity. The crime offered no clear lesson, no behavior that could be definitively corrected. It left behind instead a recognition of vulnerability that was difficult to articulate without sounding alarmist. Life required moving through the world despite that vulnerability, accepting uncertainty as a condition rather than an exception. In that sense, the case endured not as a solved narrative, but as an unresolved presence. A reminder that justice is not guaranteed by effort alone, that perception can fail, that ordinary environments can conceal extraordinary harm. Emily Harper's life, remembered in fragments of daily routine, stood in quiet contrast to the violence that ended it, an assertion of humanity against the anonymity that allowed her killer to disappear. What lingered after everything else had thinned out was not fear in its sharpest form, but a steady recalibration of how people understood the world around them. In the years following Emily Harper's death, the case existed in Austin less as an active investigation and more as a quiet reference point. It surfaced in conversations about safety, in campus orientations, in the subtle habits people adopted without consciously tracing them back to a single night in 2018. Holding keys between fingers, waiting for someone to reach their car before unlocking their own, listening more closely to footsteps, measuring distance by sound alone. These behaviors did not feel like panic. They felt like adaptation. Detectives eventually reached a stage where there was nothing new to add to the file. The evidence remained exactly as it had been, finite, static, resistant to reinterpretation. Technology advanced, databases expanded, but without new input, the case could not move. The man in the footage remained a blur of pixels and inference. He aged somewhere, invisibly, while Emily did not. Within the department, there was an unspoken understanding that some crimes do not resolve because they are not structured to be resolved. They are not puzzles with missing pieces so much as interruptions, moments where violence intersects with routine and then withdraws, leaving behind consequences that ripple outward without a clear center. Emily's murder fit that pattern. It had no dramatic buildup, no personal history between victim and perpetrator that could be traced. It was defined by its suddenness and its restraint. For Emily's family, the concept of justice shifted over time. At first, it had meant an arrest, a courtroom, a sentence that would give shape to the loss. As those possibilities receded, justice became quieter, more internal. It meant speaking her name when others no longer did. It meant insisting on the reality of her life beyond the circumstances of her death. It meant resisting the tendency, common even among well-meaning people, to frame the crime as a lesson rather than a tragedy. Her mother once described the hardest part as the ordinariness of the memories that hurt the most. Not birthdays or holidays, but small things. A particular brand of coffee creamer, a song playing in a grocery store, the sound of someone unlocking a car door at night. These moments carried no warning. They arrived unexpectedly and left just as quietly, reminding her that grief did not announce itself any more than violence had. The environment where the crime occurred continued to function as intended. Cars entered and exited. Students complained about parking shortages. The garage was maintained, repainted, folded into the city's infrastructure as if nothing irreversible had happened there. And yet, for those who knew, it remained altered. Not visibly, but perceptually. It was no longer neutral. It had demonstrated the limits of familiarity. Criminologists often speak about capable guardianship, the idea that crime is less likely when people feel observed or protected. Emily's case complicated that theory. The garage had cameras. It was used constantly. It was not isolated. And still, violence had found room to act. This did not invalidate prevention efforts, but it underscored their fragility. No system eliminated risk entirely. It only redistributed it. In the absence of resolution, the human mind searched for meaning elsewhere. Some found it in advocacy, in pushing for better lighting, better design, better awareness. Others found it in withdrawal, in minimizing exposure, in narrowing routines until they felt manageable. Both responses coexisted, neither entirely sufficient. What remained consistent was the recognition that perception, the sense of knowing where one is safe, is built from repetition. Most nights, nothing happens. Most footsteps lead nowhere. Most garages are just garages. That statistical truth is what allows daily life to continue. But it is also what creates the conditions under which rare, devastating events can occur unnoticed until they are complete. Emily Harper did not fail to perceive danger. The danger was not legible in advance. It wore the same shape as everything else around her. That was the aspect investigators returned to in private discussions, the idea that there was no decisive moment where a different choice would have clearly altered the outcome. The crime exploited normalcy itself. As years accumulated, Emily's story settled into a kind of stillness. It was no longer actively unfolding, but it was not finished either. It existed as an open question, one that did not demand constant attention, but resisted closure. For those who encountered it, through news archives, academic references, or secondhand retellings, it carried an understated weight. Not because of graphic detail or dramatic twists, but because of its restraint. In reflecting on the case, what emerged most clearly was not a portrait of evil as something monstrous or easily identifiable, but as something mundane in its execution. A man who looked like he belonged. A space designed for efficiency, not reflection. A moment that slipped between assumptions and vanished. The cost of that moment extended beyond the immediate loss of life. It altered how people trusted environments, how they interpreted silence, how they understood the relationship between familiarity and safety. It introduced doubt into places previously governed by habit alone. And yet, life continued, not because the danger had been neutralized, but because it had to. People parked their cars. They walked through garages. They made plans, trusted routines, extended assumptions of safety because the alternative was paralysis. This continuation was not denial. It was endurance. Emily Harper's life, when separated from the violence that ended it, remained defined by ordinary intentions: education, work, friendship, movement through a city she considered home. Remembering her that way does not resolve the injustice of her death. It does something quieter. It resists the reduction of a person to a case, a warning, or a statistic. In the end, the story does not offer comfort or certainty. It leaves behind a sober understanding that perception is fragile, that trust is often extended by default, and that harm can pass through familiar spaces without altering their surface. Justice, when it arrives, is not guaranteed to be complete. And the environments we move through every day, so neutral they barely register, are never as empty of consequence as they seem. The garage still stands. The city still moves. And somewhere between routine and risk, the memory of one ordinary night remains, quiet but unresolved, a reminder of how thin the line can be between safety assumed and safety lost. It began with a small, almost invisible choice, the kind that feels harmless in the moment and only later reveals how completely it rearranged the shape of a life. On a damp evening in Dublin in early autumn of 2016, the city carried its usual low, metallic hum, buses sighing at stops, tires whispering across wet asphalt, the distant thud of music leaking from pubs where windows glowed amber against the gray. Mark O'Connell noticed none of it at first. He was 34, an IT support technician who spent his days solving other people's minor emergencies and his evenings trying to forget them. His commute home from the business park near Sandyford followed the same route it always had. The slow crawl onto the N11, the radio murmuring traffic updates, the faint smell of stale coffee in the cup holder. Mark lived alone in a narrow terraced house in Rathmines. His routines were quiet and precise. Dinner was usually something reheated, eaten standing at the counter. Laundry was done on Thursdays. On Sundays, he visited his mother in Tallaght, listening patiently as she repeated stories he'd heard since childhood. He had no criminal history, no outstanding debts, no known enemies. In the language of police reports, he would later be described as a cooperative and reliable witness, which felt strange considering how unreliable memory can become under stress. That evening, rain had just started to fall. Not a storm, just a steady drizzle that turned streetlights into smeared halos. Mark drove with the window cracked, letting the cold air keep him alert. He was thinking about nothing in particular when he saw her. She stood near a bus stop that wasn't officially in service anymore, a remnant from before the route was altered. She wore a dark coat, too thin for the weather, and her hair clung to her face in wet strands. She raised one hand, hesitantly, not waving so much as asking a question without words. Mark slowed without fully deciding to. He would later struggle to explain why. He was not someone who picked up strangers. He had declined before, citing safety, citing common sense. But something about her posture, small, contained, almost embarrassed, disarmed him. She said her name was Eowif. Her voice was quiet, with a Dublin accent softened by something else he couldn't place. She told him she'd missed the last bus and needed to get toward the city center. Mark hesitated, the car idling, rain tapping against the windshield in a steady rhythm. He glanced at the back seat, empty, and then at her shoes, cheap trainers soaked through. He unlocked the passenger door. Inside the car, the air shifted. She smelled faintly of damp fabric and cigarettes. She thanked him twice, fastening her seatbelt with hands that shook slightly. Mark told himself this was just kindness, that Dublin was not the city it had once been painted as in tabloids, that fear was something manufactured by distance and headlines. He pulled back onto the road, the tires hissing softly. At first, the conversation was sparse. She stared out the window, tracing something invisible on the glass with her fingertip. Mark asked where exactly she was headed. She named a street near the canal, not far from where he would already be passing. The radio played quietly, news about housing shortages, a weather warning for coastal winds. The familiar world continued, unchanged. But there were small things. She asked him to turn down the radio, then to turn it off completely. She asked if he always took this route, her eyes flicking to the dashboard, to the speedometer. When his phone buzzed with a message from his sister, she flinched, shoulders tightening as if bracing for impact. Mark told himself she was nervous, that being stranded at night would do that to anyone. The road narrowed as they left the main artery, streetlights spaced farther apart now, darkness pooling between them. Rain intensified, drumming louder on the roof. Eowif shifted in her seat, then asked if he could pull over for a moment. She said she felt sick. Mark slowed again, uncertainty prickling at the base of his neck. He considered refusing, suggesting a petrol station ahead, but the words stalled. He pulled into a lay-by bordered by hedges heavy with rain. The engine ticked softly as he put the car in park. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she leaned forward, hand braced on the dashboard, breathing shallow and quick. Mark asked if she was all right. That was when the quiet broke. The sound came first, a sharp, sudden knock against the rear door, hard enough to jolt the car. Mark twisted in his seat, heart stuttering. Another knock followed, then the unmistakable scrape of fingers along metal. Aoife straightened, her earlier fragility gone, replaced by something focused and alert. She reached into her coat, movements efficient, practiced. Mark would later say that time seemed to compress, each second thick and resistant. He shouted, demanded to know what was happening. Aoife turned toward him, her face no longer apologetic but flat, almost bored. She told him to unlock the doors. Outside, a figure emerged from the dark hedge line, then another. Faces obscured by hoods, rain slicking their shoulders. One of them struck the window with something heavy, a dull thud that reverberated through Mark's chest. Glass spiderwebbed but held. Instinct finally cut through paralysis. Mark fumbled for the gear shift, his foot slamming the accelerator. The engine roared, tires spinning briefly before catching. Aoife screamed, not in fear, but in anger, as she lunged for the steering wheel. Her nails dug into his forearm, skin breaking, pain sharp and grounding. He swerved, the car lurching back onto the road as another blow shattered the rear window. Cold air and rain rushed in, carrying the sound of shouting. The car fishtailed, nearly clipping the curb, but Mark kept going, adrenaline narrowing his vision to the pale stretch of road ahead. Aoife struck him once more, then recoiled as he veered sharply, the centrifugal force throwing her back against the seat. She yanked at the door handle, but the lock held. In seconds that felt both endless and impossibly brief, she stopped fighting. When Mark glanced sideways, she was already pulling herself upright, face composed again, eyes calculating. She jumped from the car when he slowed at the next junction, melting into the rain before he could process the absence of her weight in the seat. Mark drove until his hands began to shake too badly to keep control. He pulled into a well-lit petrol station and stumbled inside, words tumbling out in disordered fragments. Gardaí arrived quickly, their presence solid and procedural. They photographed the damage, noted the blood on his sleeve, the broken glass embedded in the upholstery. Mark answered questions as best he could, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. In the days that followed, details sharpened and blurred in equal measure. CCTV from nearby roads showed figures moving where they shouldn't have been, a choreography of intent that made his stomach turn when investigators walked him through it. Aoife was never identified. The name, they told him gently, was almost certainly false. Similar reports surfaced. Drivers flagged down by lone women. Ambushes staged in the margins between light and dark. Mark returned to his routines, but they no longer fit the same way. He drove different routes, kept his doors locked, avoided eye contact at crossings. At night, the sound of rain against glass could send his pulse skittering. He replayed the moment he slowed the car, examining it from every angle, searching for the precise instant where choice tipped into consequence. What unsettled him most was not the violence itself, but how ordinary it had seemed at the start. A woman waiting for a ride. A city going about its business. The thin, permeable line between help and harm. Even now, years later, Dublin continues to hum around that lay-by, hedges growing thick again, glass long since cleared from the road. People still slow, still consider stopping, still believe they can read intent in a stranger's face. And somewhere in that belief lies the quiet truth the case left behind. Perception is fragile, and the most dangerous moments often arrive disguised as requests for kindness. What Mark did not expect was how the incident would continue to live inside him, reshaping ordinary moments long after the immediate danger had passed. In the weeks following the attack, his injuries healed quickly on paper. The scratches on his arm closed, leaving pale lines that looked almost deliberate, like notes written in a language his body now spoke fluently. Gardaí followed up with measured regularity, updating him on leads that never quite solidified. They spoke in cautious terms, patterns, possibilities, ongoing inquiries, phrases that carried the weight of effort without the promise of resolution. Mark listened politely, thanked them, and hung up, feeling the quiet after each call press in more heavily than before. He returned to work because routine demanded it. The office smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and burnt coffee, the fluorescent lights buzzing at a frequency that now felt intrusive. Colleagues asked if he was all right, their concern genuine but fleeting, already diluted by deadlines and minor crises. Mark answered with the same sentence each time. Yes, he was fine. Yes, it had been frightening. Yes, he was lucky. The words arranged themselves neatly, but they failed to account for the constant low-level vigilance that had settled into his muscles. Driving became an exercise in controlled tension. His hands stayed fixed at 10 and 2, knuckles whitening whenever someone approached too quickly at a junction. He noticed details he had once ignored, the way a person lingered too long near a parked car, the slight shift of weight that suggested intent rather than accident. He kept the radio off now. Silence, at least, was honest. At night, sleep arrived in fragments. Rain tapping against the window could pull him back into the car without warning, his body responding before his mind caught up. In those moments, he felt again the sudden transformation in Iowa's face, the way vulnerability had peeled away to reveal something colder underneath. It troubled him not because it was monstrous, but because it was efficient. There had been no rage in her movements, no visible pleasure, only purpose. Investigators believed the attack was part of a series, though proving it required a precision that reality rarely offered. A woman matching a similar description appeared in other reports, always vague, always shifting just enough to resist identification. Sometimes she was blonde, sometimes dark-haired, sometimes she claimed illness, sometimes fear. The constants were the setting and the timing. Marginal spaces, transitional hours, moments when people were alone but not yet expecting to be. Mark read about these cases in the paper, the language stripped of intimacy. Victims reported. Suspects fled. He recognized the contours of his own experience flattened into paragraphs, details edited for clarity rather than truth. There was comfort in knowing he was not alone, but also a quiet guilt. Others had been hurt more seriously. One man hospitalized with broken ribs, a woman whose car was stolen, her purse emptied of photos and years of accumulated receipts. Mark had escaped with his life intact, his losses largely internal. Friends encouraged him to talk, to process, to seek counseling. He attended a few sessions, sitting across from a woman who spoke gently and waited patiently through his silences. He described the event in chronological order, as if that alone might impose control. She asked him what frightened him most now. He surprised himself by answering quickly. Not strangers, he said. Familiarity. The assumption that you can tell, just by looking, who means you harm. That assumption had once guided him reliably. He thought of himself as cautious, rational. He locked his doors, avoided risky situations, trusted his instincts. The night on the N11 dismantled that narrative with unsettling ease. His instinct had told him she was harmless. His rational mind had followed. The city did not acknowledge his internal recalibration. Dublin continued to offer its invitations and its risks in equal measure. He watched people step into taxis without a second glance, saw drivers roll down windows to answer questions from pedestrians. Kindness still circulated freely, an unspoken currency. Mark wondered how many of those exchanges carried the potential for rupture, how many ended quietly without consequence. Months passed. The case remained open but dormant, its edges softening with time. Mark's mother worried aloud, her concern looping back to childhood admonitions about strangers and late nights. He reassured her, unwilling to become the story she told neighbors. He visited her less often, though, choosing instead to call to keep the connection mediated and safe. On the anniversary of the attack, he found himself back on that stretch of road without realizing it, until the hedges closed in and the streetlights thinned. Daylight dulled the menace, revealing nothing more than damp leaves and tire marks. He pulled over briefly, heart racing, then forced himself to stay. He wanted to understand the place stripped of fear, to see if it could be neutral again. Standing there, he noticed how ordinary it was. Cars passed intermittently, drivers absorbed in their own destinations. The lay-by bore no scar, no marker of what had happened. Violence, he realized, rarely left permanent marks on the landscape. It imprinted itself instead on perception, altering how spaces were read and remembered. The Garde eventually informed him that the investigation was being scaled back. Resources were limited. Leads had gone cold. They assured him the information would remain on file, ready should anything new surface. Mark thanked them, his response automatic, and felt a familiar hollow settle in his chest. Justice, he understood now, was not a guaranteed outcome, but a process constrained by probability and time. He thought often about Aoife, not as a person, but as a role. Whoever she was, whatever name she used, she represented a deliberate manipulation of trust. The weapon had not been force alone, but an understanding of social reflexes, the impulse to help, the discomfort of refusal, the stories people tell themselves to remain decent. That knowledge unsettled him more deeply than the memory of the blows. Gradually, he learned to live alongside that understanding. It informed his choices without wholly dictating them. He still helped when he could, but with boundaries sharpened by experience. He no longer believed safety was something you earned through good intentions. It was, he accepted, something you negotiated moment by moment, often without complete information. Years later, when the case surfaced briefly again in a retrospective article about unsolved roadside crimes, Mark read it with detached interest. His name appeared once, misspelled, his role reduced to a line about survival. He closed the paper and went about his day, aware that the story would continue without him, as stories always do. What remained was not fear exactly, but a sober recalibration of how he understood other people. Trust, he had learned, was not a fixed state, but a fragile agreement, easily disrupted and rarely restored to its original form. And in that fragile space between intention and outcome, ordinary life carried on, quiet and deceptive, waiting for the next small choice to reveal its true weight. The story did not end cleanly for Mark, because stories like this rarely do, and what followed unfolded not as drama but as erosion. Time smoothed the sharpest edges of the memory, but it also widened it, allowing the incident to seep into places he had never expected. His sense of scale changed first. Small problems, missed emails, delayed buses, minor arguments, lost their urgency, replaced by a persistent awareness of how abruptly things could escalate. Large decisions, meanwhile, became harder. He hesitated over choices that once felt automatic, aware now that consequences were not always proportional to intention. He noticed the change most clearly in how he read people. Conversations took on an added layer, one that existed beneath the words. He listened not just for what was said, but for cadence, pauses, the way someone's eyes moved when they thought they weren't being observed. It was exhausting, this constant assessment, but letting it go felt reckless. He lived suspended between vigilance and fatigue, neither state offering real rest. The Gardaí contacted him one final time the following spring. A woman had been detained in connection with an unrelated offense, and for a brief moment there was speculation. Mark was asked to look at photographs. He did so carefully, aware of the weight placed on recognition. None of the faces aligned fully with his memory. Some shared features, a similar mouth, the same general build, but memory resisted precision. He said so plainly. The officers nodded, unsurprised. The woman was released days later. The thread dissolved. That ambiguity settled heavily. Mark realized how much he had wanted a definitive ending, a clear narrative arc where the threat was identified and contained. Without it, the incident remained unfinished, a sentence without punctuation. He carried it forward unresolved, learning to live with the discomfort of not knowing. His work performance shifted subtly. He was still competent, still reliable, but less invested. Fixing broken systems no longer satisfied him the way it once had. He began taking longer walks during lunch, moving through the city without a destination, observing its rhythms. Dublin revealed itself in fragments. The echo of footsteps under bridges, the smell of bread from bakeries early in the morning, the way the Liffey reflected light differently depending on the hour. These details grounded him, reminded him that the city was more than the site of his fear. And yet, the environment itself remained charged. Certain places carried residue, laybys, poorly lit bus stops, transitional zones where responsibility blurred. He understood now how such spaces functioned as opportunities, how they invited projection. They were not inherently dangerous, but they allowed danger to approach unnoticed. He thought often about the men who had emerged from the hedges that night. They remained faceless in his memory, defined only by movement and intent. He imagined them afterward, dispersing back into ordinary life, their violence compartmentalized, activated only under specific conditions. The thought was unsettling, not because it was dramatic, but because it was plausible. There was no need for monsters when systems of behavior could produce the same outcomes quietly. Mark's social circle narrowed, not deliberately, but through attrition. Invitations declined, became invitations that stopped coming. He found it easier to be alone than to explain the constant undercurrent of tension he felt in groups. Dating, briefly attempted, faltered under the weight of unspoken mistrust. He struggled to articulate his boundaries without sounding paranoid, struggled even more to relax them. Therapy helped, but not in the way he had initially hoped. It did not restore him to a previous version of himself. Instead, it helped him integrate the experience without allowing it to dominate every decision. He learned to identify when his vigilance was useful and when it was simply habitual. The distinction mattered. It gave him back a measure of agency. Still, certain nights resisted all coping strategies. On those evenings, he would wake suddenly, heart racing, convinced he had heard something outside. He would stand by the window, scanning the street below, watching strangers pass under the orange glow of streetlights. Nothing ever happened. The city remained indifferent, its vastness offering no reassurance, only continuity. Public awareness campaigns appeared sporadically, warnings about roadside scams, reminders not to pick up hitchhikers. Mark read them with a detached familiarity. The language was careful, calibrated not to induce panic. He understood the necessity of that balance. Fear, after all, could be as corrosive as complacency. Years accumulated quietly. The incident receded in public memory, replaced by newer stories, fresher tragedies. Mark aged into a version of himself that carried the event as context rather than center. He moved to a different part of the city, not to escape the past, but to acknowledge change. The new neighborhood had wider streets, better lighting. He slept a little more easily there. Sometimes, when he told the story, rarely and only when pressed, people reacted with predictable disbelief. "You were lucky," they said. "That could have been much worse." He nodded, accepting the sentiment while recognizing its limitations. Luck implied randomness, but what had happened to him was structured, intentional. Reducing it to chance felt inaccurate, even dismissive. What lingered most was not anger, but a recalibrated understanding of trust. He no longer believed it was something owed by default. Instead, it became something provisional, shaped by context and behavior rather than appearance. This did not make him cold, as he had once feared it might. It made him precise. He learned to say no without apology, to help without overextending, to recognize that kindness did not require self-sacrifice. These lessons arrived slowly, unevenly, but they endured. Looking back, Mark understood that the most unsettling aspect of the attack was how easily it had inserted itself into an ordinary evening. There had been no warning, no dramatic shift in atmosphere to signal danger. Just a woman asking for help, a road he knew well, a moment of hesitation resolved in favor of decency. The violence had not announced itself. It had waited. That realization stayed with him, not as a source of fear, but as a lens. It sharpened his awareness of how thin the veneer of safety could be, how dependent it was on shared assumptions that not everyone honored. Justice, he came to see, was not always about resolution. Sometimes it was about acknowledgement, of harm, of complexity, of the limits of control. The city continued to breathe around him, unchanged in its essentials. People helped strangers. Strangers exploited that help. Most interactions passed without incident, their potential unrealized. Life persisted in that tension, balance between trust and caution. And Mark lived there too, in that narrow space, carrying forward the knowledge that perception is fragile, that evil rarely announces itself, and that the cost of understanding this truth is often paid quietly, over time, long after the headlights have faded and the road has gone dark. The night had the dull, metallic quiet that settles over Toronto when traffic thins and the city exhales through its concrete seams. Evan Mercer was 32, lean from routine, disciplined in the small ways that made his life feel ordered. He worked as a building systems technician for a mid-rise office complex near King Street. HVAC checks, emergency calls, quiet corridors that smelled of dust and recycled air. His days were predictable. His evenings were quieter. And most nights, after dinner and a brief scan of the news, he ran. Running was how Evan kept the edges of his mind smooth. He followed the same route along the Don Valley Trail, headphones low enough to hear bicycles approaching, breath settling into a measured rhythm. The path cut through pockets of darkness beneath highway overpasses where the city revealed its underside, exposed beams, stained concrete, old graffiti layered like scar tissue. He liked those stretches least, but he never changed course. Routine mattered. It was early October, 2020. The air had cooled enough to sting the lungs on the first mile, carrying the smell of wet leaves and river water. Pandemic restrictions still hovered over the city, thinning foot traffic, emptying parks earlier than usual. Evan noticed it every night, the way Toronto felt hollowed out, like a stage after the audience had left. He started his run just after 9:30 p.m., tracking his pace on a cracked phone screen. The city lights dimmed as he descended toward the valley, replaced by spaced-out lamps that buzzed faintly, a tired electrical hum that followed him like tinnitus. His footfalls echoed softly on packed gravel. Everything felt normal, almost reassuringly so. Under the Richmond Street overpass, the trail narrowed. The highway above roared intermittently, a rolling thunder that made conversation impossible even if someone had been there to talk to. Evan slowed slightly, as he always did, eyes adjusting to the deeper shadow. The concrete columns loomed, thick and damp to the touch, marked with old posters and newer warnings sprayed in red paint. He noticed the figure at first as a shape rather than a person. Someone stood near the far column, half hidden where the lamplight failed to reach. They were tall, motionless, facing the trail. Evan's mind registered the presence with mild irritation. Another person lingering where people didn't usually linger, but nothing more. Toronto had taught him to catalog strangers without engaging them. He adjusted his path to give the figure space. As he drew closer, details emerged slowly, like an image resolving on a screen with poor signal. The person wore dark clothing, loose and layered, inappropriate for running, but not unusual for the time of year. Their face was obscured by what looked like a mask, light-colored, smooth, covering the lower half of their face and nose. Not a medical mask. Something thicker, structured. Evan clocked it with a flicker of unease, then reminded himself it was 2020. Masks were everywhere. But this one didn't move. They didn't step aside or glance down at a phone. They didn't adjust their stance. They stood with their weight evenly distributed, hands down by their sides, as if waiting. Evan's pace faltered, his stride shortening without his conscious permission. His breathing changed. He told himself it was nothing. Someone resting, someone lost, someone meeting another person late. When he was within 20 feet, the figure turned its head. The motion was slow, deliberate, too deliberate. Evan felt a tightening in his chest, the primitive signal that bypassed reason. The mask caught what little light there was, pale against the dark clothing, featureless except for eye holes cut too wide. The eyes behind it were dark, unreadable, watching him. He considered stopping, asking if everything was okay. The thought surfaced automatically, a reflex of politeness. It died just as quickly. Something about the stillness felt staged, unnatural, like a held breath. He veered further left, nearly brushing the low barrier that separated the trail from the drop toward the river. His foot slipped slightly on damp gravel, and the sound seemed loud in the confined space. The masked figure shifted, just one step forward. Evan's heart spiked. He didn't look back. He lengthened his stride, forcing himself not to sprint, aware that sudden speed might provoke something worse. The roar of traffic above surged, swallowing smaller sounds. He counted steps. 1, 2, 3. Behind him, footsteps echoed. They were not running. They were walking, measured and unhurried, matching his pace just enough to stay close. The sound of shoes on gravel threaded through the highway noise with unsettling clarity. Evan's mouth went dry. His thoughts narrowed, practical and sharp. Get to light. Get past the bridge. He crossed the midpoint under the overpass where the darkness was thickest. The lamppost on the far side flickered, briefly plunging the path into near black. In that instant, something brushed his elbow. A hand. Gloved, rough, pressing just enough to be unmistakable. Evan jerked away, adrenaline surging so hard it blurred the edges of his vision. He spun around despite every instinct screaming not to. The masked figure stood inches from him now, closer than seemed possible, head tilted slightly as if studying his face. The mask smelled faintly of rubber and something chemical, sharp enough to sting his nose. "Don't," the figure said. The voice was calm, controlled. Male, Evan thought, but he couldn't be certain. It came from behind the mask without strain, almost conversational. Evan's breath rasped. He took a step back, his heel catching on uneven ground. His phone slipped from his hand and hit the gravel with a dull crack, the screen flashing white before going dark. The sound seemed to please the figure. The eyes narrowed. Traffic thundered overhead. The city continued, indifferent. Evan raised his hands instinctively, palms out. He tried to speak, but his throat locked, words dissolving into shallow gasps. He thought of every article he'd skimmed, every vague piece of advice about compliance, about not escalating. He searched the figure's posture for clues. Was this a robbery, a prank, something worse? The masked man reached into his jacket. Evan's mind fractured into sharp, useless images. The warmth of his apartment, the unfinished mug in his sink, the way the trail looked in daylight. He felt the press of the environment around him, the low ceiling of concrete, the trapped air, the smell of damp stone, as if the bridge itself were leaning in, compressing the space. The object that emerged was not a knife or a gun. It was a phone. Old, scratched, held upright, camera lens pointed directly at Evan's face. "Say your name," the man said, as if making a simple request. Evan stared at the phone, then at the mask. His pulse hammered in his ears, drowning out everything else. He shook his head, a small, frantic motion. The man's grip tightened around the device. "Say it," he repeated, the calm thinning just enough to reveal something brittle underneath. For a moment, Evan considered bolting. The far edge of the bridge was only meters away. Light waited there. People, maybe. But the man stood between him and that exit, positioned with unsettling precision. Evan realized then that this wasn't accidental. This wasn't a chance encounter. The figure had been waiting under the bridge in the dark at a time when the city was empty. And the bridge, with all its weight and noise, held them there together. As Evan's lips parted, unsure whether to comply or run, the hum of the lamplight steadied, and the masked man lifted the phone a fraction higher, framing him carefully, as if this moment had always been meant to be recorded. The air beneath the bridge felt heavier as Evan realized the silence between them was being measured, not felt. "My name is Evan," he said finally, the words scraping out of his throat, thin and uneven. "Evan Mercer." The masked man held the phone steady, saying nothing, the small red light near the camera lens reflecting faintly in his eyes. For several seconds, he simply recorded Evan's face, his sweat-slicked hairline, the tremor in his jaw, the shallow rise and fall of his chest. Evan became acutely aware of how exposed he was, how the darkness around them made the act feel less like documentation and more like possession. "Good," the man said. He lowered the phone but did not put it away. You run here a lot. It wasn't a question. Evan's heart sank with the slow certainty of confirmation. He swallowed, nodding once before he could stop himself. The man seemed to absorb this, filing it away. His body language remained loose, almost casual, but his positioning never changed. Always slightly angled, always blocking the exit toward the light. You don't vary your route, the man continued. Same time, same pace, you slow down under bridges. Evan's thoughts raced. These were observations, not guesses. Details collected over time. The unease that had followed him on earlier runs, the vague sense of being watched he'd dismissed as paranoia, rose now with sharp clarity. He wondered how many nights this figure had stood somewhere nearby, unseen, learning him. "What do you want?" Evan asked. The question felt small in the open space. The man tilted his head again. Up close, Evan noticed the mask wasn't store-bought. The edges were uneven, the material thicker around the mouth, reinforced. A faint crease suggested it had been folded and refolded, carried often. "I want to see what happens," the man said. "When you're surprised." Before Evan could respond, the man stepped back just one pace, creating a narrow gap between them. For a split second, Evan thought this was his chance. His muscles tensed, preparing to lunge past. The man seemed to sense it. "Don't," he said again, sharper this time. He raised his free hand, palm outward. Something glinted briefly between his fingers, not a blade, something smaller. Evan's eyes strained in the low light, trying to identify it. A syringe, perhaps, or a pen. The uncertainty froze him in place. "You scream," the man said calmly, "and someone might hear you. Or they might not. The highway's loud. You know that. You've been running under it for years." Evan's legs burned with unused energy. His lungs ached. He felt the environment closing in, the bridge trapping sound, the darkness swallowing distance. He nodded again, a reflexive concession. The man seemed satisfied. He slipped the object back into his jacket and took another step away, increasing the distance between them. Then another. He gestured with the phone toward the far side of the bridge. "Go," he said. Evan hesitated, suspicion flaring. "Go?" "Yes." The man's voice returned to its earlier calm. "Keep running. Don't look back." Every instinct told Evan this wasn't over, that turning his back was dangerous, but standing still felt worse. He edged forward, eyes locked on the mask. The man did not move. Evan passed him slowly, close enough to smell the faint chemical odor again, close enough to hear his breathing. Steady, controlled. When Evan reached the edge of the shadow and the lamplight touched his shoes, he broke into a sprint. He ran until his chest burned and his vision blurred, until the trail curved and the bridge was gone behind him. He didn't stop until he reached a lit intersection near Riverdale Park, where a pair of cyclists rested by a bench, talking quietly. Evan bent forward, hands on his knees, gulping air. The world felt unreal, stretched thin. One of the cyclists glanced at him, concern flickering across her face. "You okay?" Evan nodded too quickly. "Yeah, just pushed too hard." He straightened, forcing his breathing to slow. He didn't tell them what had happened. The words felt dangerous, as if speaking them might make the encounter more permanent, more real. He walked the rest of the way home, glancing over his shoulder at every reflection, every darkened doorway. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every time Evan closed his eyes, he saw the mask, the empty eye holes, the way the phone's lens had centered on him. He replayed the man's words, searching for meaning. There had been no demand for money, no clear threat, just observation, recording. In the morning, Evan noticed a new notification on his phone. An unfamiliar number had sent a single message at 2:14 a.m. "You ran well." His hands shook as he stared at the screen. He blocked the number immediately, then reported it, then deleted the message. The actions felt performative, insufficient. He called in sick to work, claiming exhaustion. All day, he listened for sounds in the hallway of his apartment building, flinching at every unexpected noise. 2 days later, Evan went to the police. The officer who took his statement listened carefully, typing notes with efficient neutrality. She asked for descriptions, height, clothing, voice. Evan answered as best he could, aware of how vague it all sounded. A masked man under a bridge. No physical harm. No clear weapon. A message that could be interpreted as harassment or nothing at all. "Do you recognize the number?" the officer asked. "No," Evans said. "It wasn't saved. No profile picture." She nodded, adding it to the report. "We've had a few similar complaints recently. People being followed, filmed, mostly at night." The word similar lodged in Evans' chest. They checked the area under the Richmond Street overpass. No cameras pointed directly at the trail. No witnesses came forward. The bridge, as always, offered cover without memory. Evans' report joined a stack of others, unresolved, incomplete. He stopped running immediately, changed his routine, took different routes to work, installed a new lock on his door, then another. Weeks passed. The city slid into winter. Snow softened the edges of everything, muting sound, reflecting light. For a while, Evan began to believe the encounter had been an anomaly, a convergence of fear and circumstance amplified by isolation. Then, in January, a body was found near the Don Valley Trail. The victim was a man in his late 20s, an occasional jogger. He had been reported missing 2 days earlier. Police would later say there were no signs of robbery, no obvious motive. A phone was recovered near the scene, its memory wiped clean. The area under the bridge showed signs of a struggle, but little else. When Evan read the news article, his hands went cold. The accompanying photo showed the same stretch of trail he had run for years, the same concrete columns. He imagined the hum of the lights, the roar overhead. He imagined a phone held steady in the dark. Detectives would eventually connect several incidents. Reports of masked figures, late-night encounters, recordings shared briefly online before being removed. A pattern emerged slowly, reluctantly. Someone was documenting fear, cataloging reactions, turning the city's hidden spaces into controlled environments. They never identified a suspect. For Evan, the aftermath was quieter but no less consuming. He lived with a constant recalibration of perception, a sense that familiarity was no longer proof of safety. Bridges became thresholds. Shadows became deliberate. He learned how easily routine could be turned into vulnerability, how observation could masquerade as coincidence until it was too late. Years later, he would still feel his pulse quicken when passing under an overpass, the echo of footsteps behind him stirring something deep and automatic. He understood then that justice, when it comes, is often incomplete, and that trust, once interrupted, never fully returns. The city continued to hum. Indifferent and immense, its ordinary faces moving through ordinary spaces, while somewhere in its hidden corridors, the boundary between watching and acting remained thin, fragile, and dangerously easy to cross.